Hi, and welcome to the CJ 305 lecture on social disorganization theory. One of the most recognized facts about crime is that it is not randomly distributed across the nation or even across neighborhoods. That is, crime does not occur equally in all areas. Instead, it tends to cluster in certain locales but not in others. It is for this reason that residents can often identify where the quote-unquote good and quote-unquote bad areas of town are. You might think about this in terms of Washington, D.C., where the bad areas that you would never go into and where the good areas that you want to go and visit with your friends or take your family when they come and visit. Social disorganization theory takes this fact, the non-random distribution of crime, as a point of departure for explaining crime. It is one of only a handful of social structural theories of crime and the only one to consider why crime rates vary across areas such as neighborhoods. Two key questions of interest for social disorganization theorists are, 1, why is crime higher in some neighborhoods than in others? And 2, is there something about the characteristics of these neighborhoods themselves, apart from the people who live in them, that fosters crime? Social disorganization theory has long occupied an important place in criminological thought and continues to do so. Despite its popularity and utility, however, nagging issues, both substantive and methodological, remain. Social disorganization theory, like many other theories, is a product of its time. During the 1920s and 1930s, as we discussed last week, researchers at the University of Chicago became increasingly concerned about what they were witnessing in terms of the effects of growing urbanization, industrialization, and immigration patterns on social organizations in Chicago neighborhoods. Park and Burgess studied how these drastic changes were affecting the city. These researchers, as we noted, had backgrounds in human ecology, and they likened the growth of the city to ecological competition, concluding that there is a natural ecology in cities where people compete for space and scarce resources. Park and Burgess's observations led to the concentric zone theory, which emphasized a process of invasion, dominance, and succession. Remember Park and Burgess's concentric zones? We talked about them last week. The target or the illustration in the middle is the concentric zone theory laid out for a city that has not yet begun to change, and the central business district has not yet begun to migrate. So as you can see, the bright red center of the graph below is the central business district. Right around it in bright orange, labeled 2, is the transition zone, the part of the city that is most likely to have the highest crime rate and consist of some businesses and some of the least expensive housing options. The area that is medium orange in zone 3 is the blue collar residential neighborhood, that is to say the residential neighborhood with the least expensive housing. The light orange zone around zone 3, zone 4, is the middle income residential neighborhood, that is to say the residential income neighborhood with slightly higher housing values than the values of the homes found in zone 3. And zone 5 is the commuter residential zones, that light taupe outer circle, and that is considered not part of the city proper at all. When Park and Burgess were doing their studies, they did not consider crime to be part of their equation. Crime only became the focus of their study when Shaw and McKay took over this research in 1942. They oriented the University of Chicago's sociology department and the research coming out of the Chicago School into studying the results of crime as a product of the neighborhood zones. Specifically, they looked at delinquency. Their primary interest was determining the extent to which differences in economic and social characteristics of neighborhoods paralleled variations in the rates of delinquency. They wanted to examine questions that included, to what extent do variations in rates of delinquency correspond to demonstrable differences in economic, social, and cultural characteristics of local communities in different types of cities? They also wanted to look at how rates of delinquency in particular areas were affected over a period of time by successive changes in the nationality composition of the population of that area. They also wanted to look at what economic and social conditions crime developed in and how it became a social tradition and became embodied in the system of criminal values. Finally, they wanted to look at the implications for treatment and prevention of wide varieties of delinquency rates in different types of communities. To address these issues, they examined the distribution of delinquency based on juvenile court cases around the time of 1900, around the time of 1920, and around the time of 1930. They also collected extensive fieldwork data from some Chicago neighborhoods corresponding to about 1930. The results of their analysis showed a concentration of delinquency. Its distribution was closely related to the location of industrial and commercial areas and to the composition of the population. Collectively, the findings from the Chicago School studies form the basis of social disorganization theory. And these studies from the Chicago School shaped the development and the direction of social disorganization theory for years to come. It's also of note that we still think of crime as being largely concentrated, and this is even evident through the development of what we call heat maps, one of which for New York City in 2014 is pictured below. You can see the bright red areas, much like the bright red areas in Parkin Burgess's original maps that corresponded to central business districts. The bright red areas here correspond to the highest crime rates, and as the areas become lighter orange, it corresponds to lower crime, with gray being the areas that have the least reported crime. Two key findings from the Chicago School became the most important foundational bases for the social disorganization theory. The researchers concluded that there was a co-occurrence of crime and social ills, such as low socioeconomic status, represented by the percentages of families on welfare, low home ownership levels, low median rental prices, and low occupation rates for the neighborhood. Another way to say this is that delinquency, crime, and deviance in general go hand in hand with other social problems such as poverty, unemployment, and residential turnover. These findings contradicted ideas about biological determinism and rational choice explanations for crime, which had been the dominant schools up until Sean McKay's research. Second, Chicago researchers also documented that these high crime areas in large part persisted, no matter what racial and ethnic groups inhabited the areas. In other words, some neighborhoods of the city of Chicago appeared to be high crime or deviant regardless of the characteristics or the nationality of the people living within them. The fact that the high crime and deviance rates persisted in certain neighborhoods, despite repeated complete turnovers in the population of these neighborhoods, suggested to many that even decades later, that quote-unquote kinds of places explanations were needed along with the quote-unquote kinds of people explanations in order to understand all of the factors that went into determining crime. So to go into the basic understandings or the basic tenets of social disorganization theory, one of the central elements of social disorganization theory is that communities can be characterized along a dimension of organization. So at one end are socially organized communities, and at the other end are socially disorganized communities. Socially organized communities have solidarity. That means internal consensus on important community norms and values, such as being crime-free. They have cohesion, defined as strong bonds among neighbors, and they have integration, defined as social interaction among residents. Collectively, these aspects of the community help to lower crime rates. Socially disorganized communities, however, lack these characteristics and have higher crime rates. The connection between social organization and crime has to do with informal social control, or the community's ability to regulate itself. In organized communities, there is evidence of informal surveillance, or the casual but active observation of neighborhood streets that is engaged in by individuals during their daily activities. So think of the woman looking out the window onto the street and monitoring what's going on there. It's also part of movement governing rules or avoidance of areas in or near neighborhoods that are viewed as unsafe. So your mom telling you, don't go to that area of the city, it's dangerous. And also direct intervention or the questioning of strangers and residents of the neighborhood about suspicious activities, chastening adults and admonishing children for behavior that is deemed unacceptable. So that's like your neighbor going and telling you if you had done something wrong that you shouldn't be doing that anymore. Or if one neighbor sees another neighbor as pulling up the fence in their yard, the neighbor's getting into a discussion or disagreement about it, and its consequences for the community at large. In short, these socially organized communities or the communities that possess the characteristics that we've just talked about have high levels of informal social control. So not written rules, but social control among residents, socially agreed upon norms, social bonds between residents. And these communities have been found to have lower rates of crime, or are thought to have lower rates of crime. Social disorganization, on the other hand, can be defined as the inability of local communities to realize common values or solve commonly experienced problems. Along these lines, we do not want communities so much to satisfy our private needs, which we can meet elsewhere, but we want them to realize common values and standards and endeavor to enact these standards, such as being crime-free. Social disorganization theory offers a specification of the effects of neighborhood characteristics on the capacity and ability of community residents to implement and maintain public norms. So social disorganization theory, in short, endeavors to explain why social norms don't exist to control crime in certain neighborhoods. So what neighborhood characteristics promote social organization and which are likely to cause disorganized neighborhoods? Theorists have typically focused on the effects of poverty, residential mobility, and racial and ethnic heterogeneity. Studies find that these ecological characteristics can and do influence the degree of social organization, with implications for crime and delinquency. For example, consider residential mobility, or the frequency with which people move in and out of a neighborhood. Some communities are stable with people living in the same homes for decades, while others are unstable and experience significant turnover. It is not difficult to understand how residential mobility can disrupt a community's network of social relations. If people continually move in and out, it becomes harder for residents to know, trust, and interact with one another, which reduces informal social controls that are needed to prevent crime. According to social organization theory, communities marked by high rates of residential turnover should experience high crime rates precisely because these communities suffer from weak social ties and little informal control. And in fact, disorganization studies find this. Similar results have been reported with respect to the effects of poverty, with racial and ethnic heterogeneity, and other ecological factors such as divorce rates and high unemployment that are thought to affect social ties and informal controls within communities. So, given what we've just discussed, the basic social disorganization causal model can be expressed as neighborhood characteristics cause social ties or lack thereof. Social ties cause informal social control or lack thereof. And informal social control or lack thereof leads to the rate of crime. In line with this causal model, I'm going to share a quote by Sampson, who states that neighborhood characteristics such as family disorganization, residential mobility, and structural density weaken informal social control networks. Informed social controls are impeded by weak local social bonds, lowered community attachment, anonymity, and reduced capacity for surveillance and guardianship. Other factors such as poverty and racial composition also probably affect informal control, although their influence is in all likelihood indirect. Residents in areas characterized by family disorganization, mobility, and building density are less able to perform guardianship activities, less likely to report general deviance to authorities, to intervene in public disturbances, and to assume responsibility for the supervision of youth. The result is that deviance is tolerated and public norms of social control are not effective. There are other examples relating to the various factors to one another. For example, Stark's research connects urban neighborhoods characterized by high deviance areas, high deviance areas being defined as those with high density, high poverty, and high transience rates. In response to these aspects of the community, such as moral cynicism among residents and diminished social control, and how these responses amplify the volume of deviance, i.e., the amount of crime. There are two important points to consider with respect to social disorganization theory, though. First is that the social disorganization theory is a society-level explanation, not an individual-level explanation. We're not talking about individuals' ability to organize themselves and their daily lives. We're talking about the amount of social connection which is present and governs daily life in a community. So one has to refer to communities as disorganized, not the individuals within them. Second, community characteristics are only indirectly related to crime. Poverty, mobility, heterogeneity, high divorce rates only cause crime indirectly by increasing levels of social disorganization. And by social disorganization, we mean the relationship bonds among community members, thus reducing informal social controls. So in short, community characteristics and crime are not directly related. They are seen as indirectly related, going through other variables that are more directly causal to crime. Social disorganization theory faces many challenges, which we're going to discuss. We're going to start with the early challenges faced by social disorganization theory and move on to some present challenges that are more prominent problems for social disorganization theory right now. Early in the development of social disorganization theory, there were conceptualization and operational problems. A key problem was with the measurement of social disorganization itself. Sean Mackay in 1942 did not clearly differentiate the presumed outcome of social disorganization, in other words, increased rates of crime and delinquency, from disorganization itself. The delinquency rate of an area was both the example of disorganization and something caused by disorganization. And you can't do that in positive studies, whether they be of crime, whether they be of political forces, whether they be of educational issues. You can't use crime to predict crime. That's a tautology. You can't use education level to predict education level. That's a tautology. You can't use the number of nuclear families to predict the number of nuclear families that there will be in the future. That's tautology. And so this problem was a significant one in the early stages of social disorganization theory. It was resolved when theorists attempted to clarify some of the unique conceptual statuses of social disorganization theory by defining it in terms of the capacity of a neighborhood, i.e. on the group level, and looking at it as a neighborhood trying to regulate itself through formal and informal processes of control. So saying that you aren't trying to assess individual crime likelihood to commit crime by the amount of immigration moving in and out of a neighborhood, or the amount of turnover in home ownership in a neighborhood. The different levels, one being group level and one being individual level, got away from this particular challenge of social disorganization theory. More recently, measurement issues have surfaced with respect to social disorganization's mediating concepts. Remember, it's the mediating concepts of social ties and informal social control that accounts for the relationship between characteristics of communities like poverty and crime. In the last few years, researchers have considered the mediating effects of other concepts, including collective efficacy and social capital. Collective efficacy builds on the concepts of social ties by arguing that the ties are necessary but not sufficient for social control. And really, that it is how the ties are activated and resources are mobilized to enhance social control that is important. Collective efficacy many will also state that it depends on conditions of mutual trust and solidarity among neighbors. With this comes the concept of social capital. Social capital is defined as intangible resources produced in relationships among persons that facilitate action for mutual benefit. So, in this case, combating crime. Researchers argue that it is the resources transmitted through social ties, or through the social capital, not the ties themselves, that are keys to facilitating social control. As you may have noticed, there is some conceptual fuzziness regarding the mediating concepts of social disorganization and how they relate to each other. Based on the definitions, it is not always clear how social ties differ from informal controls, or how collective efficacy and social capital are distinctive from social ties and social control. Okay? Conceptual fuzziness has meant that some studies use survey questions that may reflect any or all of these concepts, depending on how a researcher looks at things and classifies questions. What is needed in research on social disorganization theory, then, is studies to be more precise, there to be clear distinctions and definitions of terms and better operationalization of concepts. A second challenge for social disorganization theory is that researchers have had a question, what exactly is a neighborhood? Both in terms of the conceptualization and operationalization of the idea of neighborhood, social disorganization theory has struggled. Conceptually, there is wide variation across individuals in what constitutes their neighborhood. For example, you may say that your neighborhood is a 6x6 area or a 6 block by 6 block area surrounding your house, but your mom may say that your neighborhood is the area from east of the grocery store to west of the Target. So this really raises the question, how are neighborhoods determined? Are they determined by population size, meaning that all neighborhoods would have an equal population? Are they determined by geographic areas, meaning that you can't have neighborhoods that are much different in square miles from each other, total square miles contained? Do all neighborhoods need to be 50 square miles large? Can you have really small neighborhoods and compare them to really large neighborhoods? If you don't, make it so that neighborhoods are equal in their geographic size. Do we just go with geographic and historical boundaries of neighborhoods? Or can we somehow incorporate individual perceptions of what is their neighborhood into our studies? These are important concepts for researchers, because if we can't agree on what a neighborhood is, then using the idea of a neighborhood in our research studies means that our research studies have almost no ability to relate to the real world. Furthermore, in terms of our data, we sometimes collect and use data that are based on census surveys. These surveys themselves have block by block or tract by tract data levels, and if we can't conveniently look at how census level tract data goes and compares to neighborhood organizations, this is another problem for neighborhood level explanations of crime. And if we're going to use census data that goes tract by tract, how many of us know what census tract we live on? Probably no one. In short, what constitutes a neighborhood and how neighborhoods should be measured has not been resolved by any means. A third very significant issue to social disorganization theory is the theory's reliance on official data. All but a handful of studies use official data to document crime patterns across neighborhoods when testing the theory. Even Sean McKay relied on official court records regarding the distribution of juvenile court cases. Yet, few researchers consider the extent to which neighborhoods themselves are a consideration in police and court decisions, and there's a significant degree of community-specific bias that may exist within police departments. In other words, some neighborhoods are more likely to be over-policed than others. So, the assumption that policing practices do not vary across neighborhoods is unfounded. So the question remains that given the variation, how might policing practices influence official data collection? It is clear that official rates represent a mixture of differential neighborhood behavior patterns, neighborhood propensities to report behavior, and neighborhood-specific police orientations. So an ideal situation involves collecting alternative indicators of crime data and delinquency rates based on self-reporting or victimization data to be used in conjunction with official records. Such data efforts are occurring more, and through the use of large-scale surveys, in cities, we may have a lot of data to compare to official crime rates very soon. A reliance on official data has also led researchers to have an inability to empirically test the mediating factors linking neighborhood characteristics such as crime and poverty rates in disorganization studies. So, a final challenge has to do with researchers' ability to empirically test factors of social ties, social control, collective efficacy, and social capital. Researchers have noted that a major conceptual limitation of ecological research is the lack of attention paid to the processes that mediate the effects of community characteristics. This hasn't changed in the nearly 30 years since this criticism was first brought up. Only a handful of studies successfully document the processes laid out by social disorganization theory, especially that exogenous characteristics of neighborhood lead to crime and delinquency precisely because they affect the social ties and informal social controls. Again, only a very small handful of theories or handful of studies conclusively demonstrate that exogenous characteristics of neighborhoods lead to crime and delinquency precisely because they affect the social ties and informal social controls of neighborhoods. So the very basis of social disorganization theory has only been found and corroborated by a very small handful of theories because of the problems measuring and accounting for the key components of social disorganization theory, that being social ties, social control, collective efficacy, and social capital. As you may have guessed, the findings from this literature suggest that the process of testing this theory, specifically by testing that social ties, social control, collective efficacy, and social capital are affected by factors outside of the community's control, are very, very difficult to test and very, very difficult to define. And one finding that has emerged from existing research is that social ties may not play the role that they are expected to. Regarding new challenges that face social disorganization theory, we need to look at the roles of neighborhood subcultures. Neighborhood subcultures were a key interest of Sean McKay in the 1940s and continued to be an interest for other social disorganization theory researchers. A key question for these researchers had to do with how neighborhood subcultures became entrenched and further affected rates of delinquency. This research body questioned under what economic and social conditions crime develops as a social tradition and becomes embodied as part of a system of criminal values passed down from generation to generation. In their study in the 1940s, Sean McKay found evidence regarding community and neighborhood subcultures. They noted key differences in social values across communities, as well as documenting how this variation was linked to variation in crime and delinquency across communities. First, in areas of high economic status, they found a similarity in values, especially among values that related to the welfare of children. They found that these communities pressured children to keep them engaged in conventional activities, meaning that neighbors, if they saw children who were not their own out on the street doing nothing or doing behavior that was violating community norms, that they would discuss the incident with their children, or with the children involved. They would go to the children's parents and discuss the incident with the parents, or they would encourage the children to pursue other activities, saying, "Hey, Tommy, quit throwing rocks. Why don't you go play basketball in the park instead?" Second, in middle and high class areas, they also found similar values with respect to social controls, expressed through institutions and voluntary associations designed to perpetuate and protect those values. So community members agreed upon values, and they came to this agreement and continued to perpetuate this agreement through community organizations such as neighborhood crime watches and neighborhood potluck societies and neighborhood educational associations, where they saw each other regularly. By contrast, they found that areas of low socioeconomic status were characterized by diversity in norms and standards of behavior. So children in these areas were exposed to a wide variety of contradictory and sometimes unlawful standards, rather than consistent and conventional patterns of behavior. In low socioeconomic status communities, children were exposed to adult criminals as well, from which they could learn illegal behavior. In short, this illegal behavior was passed down from generation to generation. After Sean McKay, other researchers took interest in directly documenting aspects of what they called lower class culture, wanting to determine how it related to delinquency within poor communities. In the 1950s, Miller presented 6 key concerns of lower class cultures, including trouble, toughness, smartness, excitement, fate, and autonomy. Miller thought that a dominant component of the motivation underlying delinquent behavior was the effort to achieve status, conditions or qualities associated with the actor's most significant cultural milieu. For the first generation of social disorganization theorists, neighborhood culture was key. However, over time, research began to downplay the importance of neighborhood culture. One of the most ardent voices against incorporating ideas of neighborhood culture into research came from Kornhauser, who in 1978 wrote, quote, "So abused have been the concepts of culture and subculture in the explanation of delinquency that if these terms were struck from the lexicon of criminologists, the study of delinquency would benefit from their absence," unquote. However, more recently, cultural explanations have been resurrected in studies of social disorganization. Cultural explanations are increasingly being incorporated into standard disorganization models to predict and understand neighborhood crime rates. Research in this area is fairly new, so there's not much to be kind of explained regarding the precise roles that subculture occupies in theory. But the varying ways in which culture may be reincorporated into explanations is highlighted by considering alternative cultural explanations. Some of these explanations describe oppositional subcultures, where it is argued that lower class communities generate distinctive values and beliefs that endorse aggressive behavior and law violation. These values and beliefs are in direct opposition to conventional middle-class values, which typically support conformity to legal norms. They are passed down from generation to generation, and they're relatively independent of structural factors. Whatever role subculture occupies in social disorganization theory, it is becoming abundantly clear that, quote, cultural factors deserve greater attention, unquote, or that researchers are going to give them greater attention whether they deserve it or not. Those who argue that cultural factors are significant for social disorganization theory state that we cannot understand variations in crime rates across communities without also understanding the role that neighborhood subcultures and values play in the calculus. Another pressing issue facing social disorganization researchers today has to do with immigration patterns in the United States. Many scholars believe that, quote, the latest wave of immigration is likely to have a more significant impact on society than any other social issue, unquote. According to social disorganization theory, increased immigration to American cities should result in a higher crime rate in the neighborhoods where immigrants are most likely to immigrate to or where more immigrants already reside. Why is this? In the theory's original formulation, immigration was considered as a disorganizing force that contributed to community crime rates. So it's argued that immigration increases residential instability and racial and ethnic heterogeneity, both of which weaken informal social controls, thereby increasing crime. Concerning instability, theorists maintain that social change of any kind, including change resulting from an influx of immigrants into a community, leads to the breakdown of community social institutions, which are needed to prevent crime. Researchers note, however, that heightened population turnover as a result of immigration to an area can destabilize local institutions and reduce social control. Recall the earlier discussions on the reasons why residential instability and crime are related, according to disorganization theorists. So, concerning racial and ethnic heterogeneity, the argument is very similar. Racial and ethnic heterogeneity are theorized to affect the strength and salience of informal social controls within communities. Theorists think that in communities with diverse racial groups living in close proximity to each other, interaction between members will be low, or at least lower than in racially homogeneous neighborhoods. Heterogeneity can also undermine ties between neighbors, limiting their ability to agree on a common set of values or solve commonly experienced problems, including those related to crime. Reasons point to cultural differences being between racial groups, being and including language incompatibility and the fact that individuals prefer members of their own race or group to members of different races or different groups. As a result, according to the theory, in heterogeneous communities and neighborhoods, individuals are less likely to look out for one another and will not try, to the same extent in racially homogeneous communities at least, to take an interest in their neighbors' activities. Informal social controls will also be limited, and crime rates thus should be expected to be higher. Studies have found that racial heterogeneity contributes to higher community crime rates. In essence, social disorganization's traditional approach to immigration and resulting residential instability and racial and ethnic heterogeneity is that immigration serves as the disorganizing force that can lead to more crime and higher crime rates in communities. Despite these claims, however, over the years, there has in fact been no study that has linked immigration to rising crime rates when other factors were accounted for. To state that again, immigration and crime do not go hand in hand. Most recently, studies of neighborhood crime rates found the exact opposite of what was predicted by social disorganization theory. That is, that immigration into an area is unrelated and in some cases negatively associated with crime rates, controlling for a host of other factors. In other words, when other factors are controlled for, increasing immigration into an area can actually lead to the lowering, or is associated with the lowering of crime rates in that area. In an example, Miami, El Paso, and San Diego neighborhoods that were predominantly Latino and African American found that there was not an increase in homicide levels when immigrants came into these communities. In another study of Black homicide rates in the northern section of Miami, an area that has received numerous recent arrivals of immigrants from Haiti and contains an established African American community, researchers found that the presence of immigrants does not appear to have the disorganizing effect predicted by social disorganization theory. In another study comparing and contrasting Asian homicide rates in the 3 largest Asian American communities in San Diego, a group of researchers also found that recent immigration does not have appeared to have the negative consequences expected by disorganization theory. The implication from all of these studies is that community social controls may actually be strengthened by immigration rather than weakened by it. So how are we to understand this research on immigration in the context of social disorganization theory? Was social disorganization theory just wrong? Or is the theory maybe out of date with what is happening today in terms of immigration, neighborhood change, and crime? This small but significant literature has found and has forced us to rethink the role of immigration as it relates to social disorganization theory and how we think of the effects of immigration on communities and their crime rates beyond the traditional disorganization argument. For example, Martinez argues in 2006 that, quote, contemporary scholars are now more open to the possibility that an influx of immigrants into disadvantaged and high-crime communities may encourage new forms of social organization and adaptive social structures. Such adaptations may mediate the negative effects of economic deprivation and form various iterations of demographic heterogeneity, including ethnic heterogeneity, cultural heterogeneity, and social heterogeneity on formal and informal social controls, thereby actually decreasing crime. One new approach that makes this claim is that the immigration revitalization thesis. This thesis argues that immigration revitalizes poor areas and strengthens social controls due to familial and neighborhood institutions and enhanced job opportunities associated with these enclaves. This results in there being less crime. These mechanisms and exactly how immigration affects neighborhoods and their crime rates has yet to be fully studied. And it remains a challenge for future social disorganization theorists to parse out. Additionally, social disorganization theorists may need to rework the theory to more accurately reflect how immigration patterns and the presence of immigrants within communities is associated with neighborhood crime rates. This concludes the lecture for this week. Please let me know if you have any questions.